Welcome to One Mind Brainwaves. I'm your host, Brandon Staglin. Today's topic is new directions in schizophrenia treatment. Today, two people will be joining us who are experts in the research and education around schizophrenia, including how to treat it better, how to manage it, and even how to recover from it. Dr. Carl Sellgren is a researcher and psychiatrist at the Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm, Sweden. And Bethany Yeiser is a mental health advocate and author. And we'll be talking with them today about their work to educate people and improve the treatments for schizophrenia. Bethany is also a very talented musician, and she's going to share with us a very special song in just a few minutes. But first, a little story related to our topic today. So schizophrenia is an illness that can be treated in a variety of ways, and I'm a strong believer, of course, that science is a very important factor in developing ways to help people with schizophrenia. I've been the lucky beneficiary of 3, at the time, cutting-edge treatments for schizophrenia, have been turning points in my recovery, including in 1990, when I first was diagnosed, clozapine. It was a new medication for schizophrenia then. It helped me kind of manage my suicidal ideation, get back into life again, and back into reality, back into school and succeed there, including cognitive training in 1998, which was very helpful for me to be able to pay attention better and be more socially fluent. And that was another turning point in my recovery. And then in 2005, the launch of aripiprazole, then under the brand name Abilify, which helped me kind of recharge my emotional range. And this was super helpful for me to get back into life again. So science is an essential part of helping people with schizophrenia. And I'm very excited today to be leading One Mind to help people through science who experience these illnesses. And I'm also excited through One Mind to be working with great advocates and researchers like Dr. Sellgren and like Bethany, who we'll talk to today. So I'm very glad they're with us today. Let's bring in Bethany now. Bethany Yeiser is the president of the Curesz Foundation, Curesz, which works to provide education and dispel misconceptions surrounding schizophrenia. She's also the author of the memoir, Mind Estranged, My Journey from Homelessness and Schizophrenia to Recovery. Bethany, welcome to Brainwaves.
Thank you.
Excited to have you with us again today. And thanks for being with us.
You're welcome.
You bet. In your book, you detail a happy life. When you were younger, you were a violin teacher, and you played in orchestras, and you performed at big events. This was prior to the onset of your schizophrenia symptoms. How did music contribute to your mental wellness in your childhood and teenage years?
Music provided a great way to meet new friends, a brand new social circle. I was meeting with high school students who were highly competitive, very dedicated to academics. And there was a lot of healthy competition. You know, I'm practicing 4 hours a day. I was teaching a couple of kids violin lessons in high school. When I got to college, I had some friends who were music majors. And since I was good enough, they invited me to play for recording studios for pay, which was very exciting. But it's an amazing thing to play in an orchestra. And it's not just yourself, but a whole group of 100 people who are all joining together to share their skills and make something more. So being in an orchestra was really inspiring. Also, music is good for the mind in other ways. It's been shown that string players often do better in mathematics, and I did very well in calculus classes in high school. But, you know, overall, music was a wonderful opportunity in many ways.
Fantastic. Yeah, I love music as well, listening to it and playing it. You're way beyond me in terms of skill, which we'll hear about in just a moment when you share your song with us. Very impressed with your violin playing. You also, as you continue your story, you talk about college successes in terms of academics, like you kind of touched on a moment ago. And you also talk about eventually the development of your psychotic symptoms, which then led to bouts of homelessness and even incarceration in some cases. Mm-hmm. What caused you to finally seek help? And ultimately, how did music also help in your recovery?
I had typical anosognosia, lack of insight into my schizophrenia. I was sleeping outside under the stars and had been for 13 years. And when I was finally picked up by police and taken for evaluation, I had no idea that I was sick. I should have seen it coming. One of the signs of my mental illness was apathy. And that's hit in 2002. I used to play violin all the time, love playing violin. It was one of my favorite things, and I just lost interest. And while I was very psychotic, I actually sold my violin for a very small price and sent the money to a nonprofit in Africa. Um, when I was finally diagnosed and began medication, I wanted to play the violin again. That interest came back. And I was mourning over the fact that I had sold my beautiful violin, for a very, very low price. And when I came back to my parents' house in Ohio from California to recover from mental illness, I went off my medication and I was having powerful command hallucinations when I was off the medication. And one of the command hallucinations was to break the violin. And my violin was my treasure, but the voices had taken over. And my violin, actually, I broke it. And finally, I realized that something was wrong, and I was willing to always comply with medication. And a church friend gave me this new, beautiful violin as a gift. In a few minutes, you'll hear a recording of me playing that violin. But it's been very interesting to me when I look at the course of my life. As I was becoming more and more mentally ill, I had less and less interest in violin. And as I was recovering from schizophrenia over time, my ability to play the violin well was slowly regained. And today I'm not a violin professor, a virtuoso, but I play often for church services, sometimes weddings and events. And every time I play my violin, I am just reminded of my recovery, which I am so grateful for.
Wow, that's a beautiful story to hear how you came from a point of where the voices were commanding you to like forsake that dimension of yourself that was so precious to you, and it must have been horrifying to you to like be kind of faced with that choice at the time, I imagine. But now that you're able to play again, does it have a sense of healing? Reconnecting with that part of yourself.
Yes.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So you're going to share a violin performance with us now. Can you please tell us a bit about the song that you're going to share via recording, Melodie by Christoph Gluck?
It's, right, that's correct, Melodie by Christoph Gluck. It was one of my favorite over the years, and I performed it for many different events when I was in high school, sometimes for weddings. But this song really gets the best out of my new violin. My new violin has a very nice high register, and the vibrato really brings out the best in this violin. So I'm grateful every time I play for my new violin and my new chance at life.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. I can't wait to hear the beautiful vibrato from this high register violin on the lovely song Melodie by Christoph Gluck as you play it. So let's hear that now, please. Bethany, that is so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that song with us. That's why we love to open our show with a musical performance.
You're welcome.
You bet. God, it's just an amazing way you play. What does music do for you today? You kind of touched on that, but do you anything else you'd like to add?
Music is a gift, and it's such a privilege to be able to share music with my church every week and at different events. I also teach piano lessons. Piano was always my second instrument. I have a 9-year-old little girl, and I'm teaching her chords and basic sight reading on piano and really enjoying that. I especially love social opportunities that open up through music, performing with other musicians, remembering how much I enjoyed orchestras in the past. So, and I also find it very special to be able to perform again with my dad. My dad is accompanying me in the piece that you just saw, the recording. When I was in high school, playing violin together with dad accompanying me was one of my very, very favorite things. And we performed very, very often. And then when I came down with the schizophrenia, I was estranged from my parents for 4.5 years. It's a long story, but I was very paranoid of them and afraid they would stop me from making this worldwide impact. You'll have to read Mind Estranged if you want to hear more. But yeah, all that time went by, 4.5 years. And then when I recovered, my parents always said, this is a brain disease. This is not your fault. We just want you to get better. We'll do anything to make your recovery possible. And at that time, I started practicing violin again with dad accompanying me. And it just makes me more grateful than ever for our renewed relationship.
Oh, it's wonderful to hear you're back in a close, loving relationship with your parents again and your family. It's so important for me too to have that close relationship with my family. So I totally empathize with that. And the fact you can play music together with your dad, that's just kind of, I guess, the icing on the cake that makes it so much more additionally wonderful to have that time together. Thank you for sharing, Bethany. Yeah, thank you. I'm now going to bring in Dr. Sellgren Majkowitz. He's a psychiatrist and researcher at the Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm, Sweden. He's also the recipient of the 2019 One Mind Kaiser Permanente Rising Star Award. Viewers, please feel free to post your questions for our guests at any time. Carl, welcome to Brainwaves. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Really happy to be here.
Excited to have you on. You've been doing a lot of research involving brain synapses in schizophrenia and how they can influence the development of the illness. Can you please tell us what you've discovered about the relationship between how brain synapses change over time in the development of schizophrenia?
Mm-hmm. Well, so the last couple of years, our lab has focused very much on the fact that if you look at schizophrenia patients as a group, in certain frontal regions of the brain, you see fewer synapses. And this has basically been known for decades. But the problem has been that we don't really know the cause of this. So we don't really know the mechanism causing this.
Can you please explain what a synapse is for our viewers?
So a synapse is basically a connection between two neurons, two brain cells. So basically, the brain cells communicate with each other, and within the cell, it's basically an electrical signal. But then when the flow of information is going to go from one cell to another cell, they usually use a chemical signal. So basically, they release neurotransmitters that then docks onto the other cells. So it's basically part of communication flow in the brain, basically. And it's also the part in this circuit that the brain is usually using for regulating the flow of information. So if you have if you think about like a traffic system and so on, it's the place where you sort of measure how many cars is coming, and if you should do something, if you should change the flow of cars. So it's a sort of regular steps in the brain. And you have trillions of them, so they're all over the brain, basically.
That's fascinating. Great. So how do brain synapses and their development affect the development of schizophrenia?
Well, so basically, the only thing we knew before was that in certain regions you have fewer of them. And people had been speculating for quite some time that it could be related to something called synaptic pruning. And synaptic pruning is basically a part of the neurodevelopment. Because when you get your brain, you at the beginning you have a lot of synapses. And then what's happening when you start using these synapses, some of them will be useful and others will be not. So basically what the brain is doing is that it removes some synapses that is probably not working that much, while other ones that is sort of strengthening the neural circuits, they are getting stronger. And that part, people have speculated that it could be basically going overboard in schizophrenia. So in some regions of the brain, you have too much of it. But the problem before was that we didn't know that much about the mechanisms. So I think it was around 2010 approximately that the lab of Beth Stevens and also our labs started to looking at these processes in mice. So they then looked at the visual system where you have a lot of synaptic pruning. And they had a quite surprising finding that microglia, which is a sort of immune cell in the brain, was actually targeting synapses with low activity, and they were basically engulfing them, saving the neuron, but just taking away the synapses. And at that time, I was doing a lot of research on microglia in schizophrenia. And we had a lot of findings from cerebrospinal fluid saying that there is probably some sort of activation of microglia. So when I saw these studies, I thought it was really interesting in the context of schizophrenia and the sort of hypothesis about increased pruning. So then we started develop modeling to try and use cells from patients to try and see if we in a dish could set up a model that's sort of mimicking what's happening in the brain and then study that in the context of schizophrenia. So we basically use techniques where we take a very tiny skin biopsy, just a couple of millimeters, or blood cells, and then we reprogram those cells. So we get neurons with synapses, and we also developed a protocol to make microglia-like cells. And then we put those together in a dish. And then quite surprisingly, we could see that this sort of process that's happening in the brain seemed to be happening in the dish too. So when we then refined this model, we could quite, more exact measure how much pruning you actually have. And then you have cells from one patient or one control. So then we could take more lines from patients and from controls, and we could compare the different groups. And then we actually saw that there were more synaptic pruning in our model in cell lines from schizophrenia patients compared to controls.
You actually saw that process in action in the dish. That's amazing that you could actually observe it happening. It's so hard to study the brain, but you're developing techniques that actually let you do that. So kudos to you. And I'd love to hear more in just a moment about what you're discovering about how that can help with treatments. Let's move to Bethany for a moment. And thanks for your answers, Carl. Bethany, following your own recovery, you went on to found the Curesz Foundation in 2016 to let people know about schizophrenia and the fact that it actually is treatable. You feature many personal stories from survivors on your website, and that I'm sure provides a lot of hope for your followers. What is the most important thing you'd like people to know about schizophrenia?
There are two things I'd like people to know. One, schizophrenia is a brain disorder. We're talking about a neurochemical illness. It's actually a syndrome, many diseases that look different from each other. I thought that schizophrenia years ago, I thought that it was an emotional disease. I thought it was associated with an eccentric personality. I thought it was an excuse for bad behavior. I would like people to know this is a physical illness. It's like diabetes or other problems, breaking a leg. There should be no shame in getting treatment for any illness. And the second thing that I'd like to really emphasize is that it is treatable. Years ago, I thought that having a schizophrenia diagnosis meant that you were locked away somewhere in an asylum for life, or that you were sitting in a chair looking like a zombie, rocking back and forth, unable to work, unable to go to college, unable to enjoy meaningful relationships. But I mean, that's what it used to be decades back. But today, this brain disease is indeed treatable. And if you go to the Curesz website and click survivors, we have 26 stories of people. They're not just getting through every day. These are people who are recovered, or at least they're thriving despite schizophrenia. They work, volunteer, and have meaningful relationships. I've been told many times, oh, you recovered completely, so it must not have been schizophrenia. And I wanted to prove that it's not just me. That's not true. People can get better from schizophrenia today, and they can move on.
Bethany, I love knowing you and some of those other schizophrenia survivors that are on your website, because it inspires me so much to see how well you and those other folks are doing, and the good they're doing in the world through sharing their stories. So thanks for being one shining example of somebody who's recovered, to inspire other people to know they too can recover, and to know that it's worth supporting research to improve treatments for the illness to help more people into that recovery space. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then Bethany, your Curesz website provides a great deal of information about current cutting edge treatments, kind of like Carl is seeking to develop, and underutilized treatments. How does someone decide which treatment might be best for them? Are there assessment tools?
A patient definitely needs to work with their doctor to figure out what's best for them. But the Curesz Foundation promotes 3 medications or classes of medications. First of all is long-acting injectable antipsychotics. The norm is for people to get on pills in the hospital. They leave the hospital, and often they never take the pills, they never follow up, or perhaps they're like me and they take them for a few weeks and then say, I can't stand the side effects, and give up. Long-acting injectables are very underutilized, especially in the United States. Our Curesz scientific director, Dr. Henry Nasrallah, thinks they should be prescribed perhaps 80% of the time, used a lot, versus now when it's more like, I believe it's 10%. So we're very enthusiastic about people getting an injection to avoid relapse. 2, we like to provide education about medications for tardive dyskinesia. For decades, tardive dyskinesia has not been treatable. It is a debilitating movement disorder that's a side effect of antipsychotic medications, often affecting your face. It can cause you to make movements as though you're chewing gum. It can cause you to have movements in your fingers like you're playing an invisible piano. It can affect your eyes. It can even affect the diaphragm and breathing. Debilitating condition. But we'd like everyone to know that there are 2, not just 1, but 2 new medications out as of 2017 called valbenazine and deutetrabenazine. And today there is hope for tardive dyskinesia. And then the third is clozapine, which I have taken for 12 years with no relapse. Some of our Curesz survivors have taken it for decades. At least one of our survivors has taken it for 30 years with no big relapse. Clozapine can be, I've heard it called a miracle medication before. For me, it really did feel like a miracle. Clozapine is for treatment-resistant patients, and it's a drug that works when all other drugs do not work. I spent 12 months trying 5 different medications with very little success in 2007. And I thought that my life was basically over. I'd never work or go back to school again until I began clozapine. 30% of patients deserve a trial of clozapine. 4 to 5% actually get it. So if you do the numbers, that means that there's 500,000 people living in the United States who are disabled, many of them totally disabled, as I was, who have not tried clozapine. And there's a chance that this 500,000 people, or many of them, might be brought to full recovery on clozapine. And so many of them have never even heard of it. So again, Curesz offers education about it, especially about injectables, TD meds, and clozapine.
It's fascinating to hear you talk about not only your experience with clozapine, because I had a similar experience back in 1990 with clozapine. I had tried like 3 different medications. They had awful side effects, and they weren't helping me recover. And then I tried clozapine, and then I was able to go back to school. I was functioning well enough, and the symptoms were controlled well enough that I could do that. So I understand that it's in many cases one of the most effective drugs for schizophrenia. It just isn't prescribed as often due to some of the side effects that psychiatrists are worried about. But the side effects can be managed and can be monitored. And so I agree, it should be used more often. If it should be looked into more often. And talking about tardive dyskinesia, I didn't know that there were medications to treat that. That's fantastic.
2017, again, valbenazine and deutetrabenazine, made by Neurocrine, valbenazine, and Teva, deutetrabenazine. But I mean, this is a huge breakthrough in the field. There are so many patients that have TD, and because of their psychotic symptoms, they cannot go off their medication. And these people may lose jobs, lose friendships. I've met some other people with tardive dyskinesia through Neurocrine. We had a female pastor with tardive dyskinesia. It made her have movements that looked like she was chewing gum. And her boss talked to her after one of her services and said, "Why were you chewing gum while you were preaching?" And she realized that if something didn't help with her TD, if there wasn't a medication available, she was going to lose her job. And that's very typical with tardive dyskinesia. It can really hurt your career. So these TD medications are a really big breakthrough. You know, just even for me, I mean, I do so much work with the Curesz Foundation, recording videos, giving interviews. And then when I developed tardive dyskinesia in 2017, just months after these medications were available, there was hope. You know, I was able to get on the TD med, and my TD almost completely went away, and I can resume regular life. So we like schizophrenia patients in general, everyone, to know about these meds. And if you go to the Curesz Foundation website, you can find under our resources a clozapine expert panel and tardive dyskinesia expert panel. These are groups of doctors that prescribe clozapine and that prescribe medications for tardive dyskinesia. So we can help you find a doctor.
What a great resource that is. Thanks for providing that for our community. That's just really phenomenal. You have those resources available. Carl, let's move back to you for a moment, please. A couple of questions for you. Do you treat patients who experience tardive dyskinesia, and do you think some of those medications could be helpful for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, which is good. We see it less often these days than before. So it's to be honest, in the clinic, it's at least in my clinic, it's kind of not a common side effect anymore. But yes, of course, yeah.
Great. So hopefully Bethany's website could be a resource.
Yeah. And if I just could comment, like in general, of what Bethany said, because I think it was a lot of important things there. I mean, I usually joke sometimes that when you read research papers about schizophrenia and you read the first couple of sentences, it kind of sounds like all the medications that is out there is kind of crap, basically. And, you know, we should really like focus on getting new medications and so on. And that is true, of course, because for a lot of patients, the medicine is not perfect, right? But we shouldn't forget, on the other hand, that I mean, if you can find a patient that is working for you and the side effects is acceptable, it can do wonders, right? And this, I think it's important that we don't forget, because I think it's, as a doctor, the most important thing is not just to sort of always try to look to these new experimental treatments, but instead also like trying out what we have on the market, and try as a doctor to be active, to listen to the patient when it comes to side effects, trying to sort of get an alliance where you actually can get the patient to try out a medication. And then you have to have this sort of alliance where you sort of talk about side effects and you try to try different options and so on. So I think this is really important. We researchers should talk about that more, that the medications are actually working in a lot of cases.
Yeah, that's true. I had kind of a dicey relationship with my psychiatrist back in the 1990s when I didn't want to take medication. I was afraid of the side effects, but he did convince me that I should try some, and that was really helpful, and ultimately in the long run, of course. I'm glad that he did. But in terms of, avoiding the syndrome of schizophrenia, are there risk genes, Carl, that could be targeted to develop treatments to help people either halt the onset of or even prevent the development of schizophrenia at all?
So that's a very complicated question, I would say. So basically, I mean, people have been talking about this from different aspects. One is, for example, genetic engineering and so on, which is basically that you go into the DNA, you try to manipulate it, and then you hope that you will avoid the disease or get less symptoms and so on. That technique has actually already now been used in other type of diseases. But for schizophrenia, I don't think that's the way forward, to be honest. Not now and not in 50 years or even 100 years, because the problem here is that it's what we call a polygenic disorder. It means that we have a lot of common genetic risk variants, and they all just increase a tiny bit of risk. It's basically a combination of a lot of common variants that together give you the high risk of getting schizophrenia. And that would mean you have to sort of manipulate the DNA a lot, which would probably not be a good risk-benefit situation. But when it comes to targeted treatment, I would say yes, because I think we're kind of getting there. Because these genetic risk variants, they can of course just give a small risk increase. But on the other hand, they can converge on a mechanism, and the mechanism can sort of carry the risk of several different risk variants. So I mean, the thing I was talking about before with pruning, I think it's a good example. There you have a risk gene, which is the complement factor 4. And that only increases risk. It only gives a small risk increase. But when you're looking at pruning, like we, for example, did in our models, we also see that this specific genetic variant is just contributing a small part to the differences between cases and controls. So there's probably a lot of other risk variants that we actually, when we have started studying it, although it's still preliminary data, we see that they are also contributing to this excessive synaptic pruning. And my hope is that it would be the same for other type of mechanisms. And when you find mechanism, then you can actually find targeted treatments. So basically, no mechanism, no targetable treatments. And the really good thing right now is that we're coming into an era where we are going from just identifying risk variants to actually look at specific mechanism. So in that perspective, I'm really optimistic that we are actually going into a new era when it comes to schizophrenia research.
Wow, that's so great to hear. You're finding these mechanisms that can be targeted down in the near future to help develop new treatments to prevent schizophrenia from developing. Bethany, how does that resonate with you? As someone who's experienced schizophrenia, what are your thoughts on the value of research to prevent schizophrenia?
Oh, it's tremendously important. I would like to say, though, one of the things Curesz really emphasizes is that marijuana is not safe. It may be natural, poison ivy is natural, But if you smoke pot, your risks of developing a psychotic illness go up 6 to 8 times. So Curesz Foundation would highly recommend to young people that they avoid illicit drugs, including marijuana. But I'm looking forward to groundbreaking research. Perhaps someday we'll be able to prevent the person from getting schizophrenia while they're in the womb. And I hope that we see developments in that area in our lifetimes. It's very exciting.
That would be just the holy grail, to find out if somebody was at risk, right even before they're born, and help them right away onto a path that could, be much more constructive for them in their life. So together we're talking today about new directions in schizophrenia treatment with Dr. Carl Sellgren, who is a researcher and psychiatrist at the Karolinska Institutet in Sweden, and also Bethany Yeiser, who is the founder of the Curesz Foundation and current president of it, and also the author of Mind Estranged, My Journey from Homelessness and Schizophrenia to Recovery. If you have any questions for our guests today, please feel free to post them in your Facebook window. And if you have any thoughts about what our guests are discussing and how it might benefit other people that you know, please share this webcast with them. Back to you, Carl. Ongoing management of schizophrenia symptoms can be extremely challenging, even in the best of times, as we kind of discussed today already with Bethany and with you. What about during times of crisis, like we're going through right now? What are some of the best ways to manage symptoms in our current environment?
Well, in relation to the pandemic, I would definitely see that it's a struggle. In general, I would say for all type of chronic diseases that is like needing a sort of ongoing treatment, the pandemic becomes a problem. And I think that's basically because we're getting all this information, which is of course accurate, that we should avoid social distancing and so on. But that also means that a lot of people with chronic diseases, they avoid seeking healthcare in this pandemic. And that I think is a general problem. So for example, I have a couple of colleagues here in Sweden that looked at cancer diagnosis. And it's been rapidly decreasing since the pandemic started. And I don't think that's because the COVID-19 is sort of taking away cancer. It's because people don't really seek healthcare right now. And that I think is complicated because on the other hand, if you have a more severe schizophrenia, getting worse in your schizophrenia may, personally, for one person, be a bigger risk perhaps than even getting the virus. So here I think it's an important thing that people with schizophrenia should continue to have a continuous discussion with the healthcare providers. If you can do digital meetings and so on, I think that's great if it works. But in sometimes perhaps you also need to sort of shouldn't be afraid of at least contacting your doctors and trying to sort of make sure that the treatment is ongoing and that you sort of get what you need to continue to be functioning. But it's a struggle, of course, and the social distancing in itself is hard for everybody, and it's probably, I'm assuming, much harder if you have psychiatric symptoms at the same time. So a lot of the sort of daily interactions you may have with nurses or with therapists and so on is likely not as often as before right now. And I think that's also something that we sort of together have to try and fix. So it's continue to work during the pandemic.
Yeah, that is a thorny problem. I like that you mentioned telehealth, the ability to contact your psychiatrist or clinician digitally, like over the internet. And I talk to a psychiatrist via that means, like via video conference once a month now, to stay in touch I find that really helpful. Bethany, does that resonate with you? Are there other ways you can think of to help people with schizophrenia manage their illness during the pandemic, and maybe even self-manage when they can't get in touch with their psychiatrist or clinician?
People with severe mental illness tend to isolate themselves when they need social circle the very most. So I would encourage people to be a friend to your loved one or your friend who has severe mental illness. Do everything you can to be careful, socially distance, wear your mask, but do see people as much as you can. Take advantage of Zoom calls. Stick to a regular schedule. A lot of us have lost volunteering and work opportunities. And it's really important, if we're going to be healthy, that we be productive every day, sticking to a schedule. If you're bored, teach yourself a foreign language online or find other productive ways to spend your time. But realize that structure is really important.
Hear, hear. Well said. Thank you. So, Bethany, thanks for explaining about how people with schizophrenia can manage their wellness. But are there other ways that you'd like viewers to know about how they can help they can change the way that schizophrenia is perceived? That folks with schizophrenia are not necessarily to be sequestered, but they're people like anyone else. I mean, that's my opinion. Maybe you feel the same way. How can updated public perceptions of schizophrenia improve people's lives over time?
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at it person by person. If you have a loved one or friend who's struggling with mental illness, including schizophrenia, these people need support. Be available, be a friend. Go to the hospital and visit the person. Bring the person to pastoral. Send them a balloon and a chocolate bar. Treat them like you would treat anybody else who has an illness. And another thing I can say that's really important is watch your words. Don't talk about the schizophrenic politician or those crazy pills, or say that someone did something erratic because they missed their medication. So if you really want to help, I would encourage you to be a leader, carefully watch what you say, learn, educate yourself about severe mental illness. I think everybody should know a little bit about schizophrenia and other mental illnesses. Again, that they're brain disorders, that they're treatable. And when you educate yourself and you reach out to even one person at a time, you're making a difference.
Yeah, that's beautiful to consider that, to know that when we can reach out to somebody who's in a challenging spot, it makes a difference for them no matter who they are. Thanks for that reminder. And then finally, Bethany and then Carl, what words of encouragement or hope do you have for people out there regarding research and treatment for schizophrenia, both today and tomorrow?
Should I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
So schizophrenia has 3 clusters of symptoms, which are, of course, positive, negative, and cognitive. I did well in my recovery primarily because I had more positive symptoms that went away on medications versus negative symptoms like apathy, cognitive symptoms. And today, if persons are struggling with cognitive and negative symptoms, they can still be disabled even when hallucinations and paranoia may go away. I get excited about companies that are working to create drugs and other therapy for cognitive and negative symptoms. And that's another thing I'd like to see in my lifetime. I'd like to see schizophrenia treated in the womb in my lifetime. I'd also like to see treatments come out for cognitive and negative symptoms. And I think we're getting there. I think we're getting closer and closer.
Bethany, that's it's kind of funny that you bring that up, and that there's a major research partnership that just launched with the National Institute of Mental Health, One Mind, NAMI, the Wellcome Trust, and 3 pharmaceutical companies putting in a lot of resources and expertise to develop new medications for the early stages of schizophrenia, especially focused on cognitive and negative symptoms. It's called the Accelerating Medicines Partnership for Schizophrenia. I'd be happy to let you know more about that offline, or and viewers, you can learn more about that on the NIMH's website as well. And Carl, what about you? What do you think are words of hope about research and treatment for schizophrenia?
Well, I agree with what Bethany said, and from my research perspective, I would like to emphasize again that we sort of going into an era where we sort of leave this just looking at genetic risk variants and going to mechanisms, and we're trying to link those mechanisms to specific symptoms like cognitive symptoms or negative symptoms and so on. So I'm extremely positive right now. I think we are getting there, and the odds are getting more and more favorable of us getting targeted treatments. So we're in an extremely, productive phase right now in general.
That's great to hear. It's so needed, so needed. Thanks for sharing those words of hope, Carl and Bethany. And viewers, thank you too. If you'd like to ask any other questions of our guest today, you can post questions at onemind.org/brainwaves. If you'd like to learn more about schizophrenia, please check out the Cure's website at curesz.org. Bethany and Carl, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your expertise.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Every day trying to find the strength. I just want things to go back to normal.
Science is racing to find treatments for the virus. Vaccines are on the horizon.
I don't know what to do.
But what about the mental health research needed to sustain our lives during and after the crisis? OneMind is funding the science to revolutionize treatments and provide hope. OneMind, accelerating brain health for all. Help us fund new treatments at onemind.org.